the capital was shrouded in an eerie silence. Only a few days had passed since Agna's return from yet another trip to the orphanage, but during this time, it felt as if the usual hum of life in the city had faded. The streets were less bustling, and the faces of passers-by looked tired and alert, as if a storm was about to break. Agna stood in the courtyard of the moonlit Night Order's training grounds. The silver lace of the mantle, a gift from Lucia, draped from her shoulders, but didn't hinder her movements. In her hand, Agna held a sword. She was diligently practicing a series of strikes that she had devised herself. Short lunges combined with bursts of lunar energy. Sometimes her movements were too abrupt, causing the light to flicker unevenly, but gradually it smoothed out, becoming softer, filling the courtyard with silver glimmers. Usually the courtyard was crowded during training. Priestesses, adepts, knights. But today there was only silence, just the sound of her footsteps and the rustling of fabric. Most of the adepts and priestesses remained in their cells or had gone to assist the townsfolk. With the city overcrowded with refugees and rumors of the plague, there was a constant need for healers and mages who could strengthen protective wards. Finishing another series of strikes, Agna paused to catch her breath. The thought pulsed in her mind that the city seemed to be holding its breath. She saw rare guards pass by the gates, whispering to each other. Everywhere, people sought help or advice. However, since morning, Agna had felt an unsettling unease. The sky appeared darker than usual. But now, lifting her gaze, she noticed an unnatural bloody red hue. She shuddered involuntarily. "It's time to see what's going on," flashed through her mind. Hiding her training staff, Agna left the courtyard and made her way to the Order's gates. She decided to first check the nearby districts, where she had recently assisted the sick, to ensure everything was in order. But before she could take more than a few steps, she sensed an even more oppressive atmosphere in the street. People were staring at the sky, some pointing at it with trembling hands. Agna lifted her gaze and saw that the heavens seemed to be cracking with blood-red streaks. It felt like a storm was coming. Something was clearly brewing. She needed to find the High Priestess quickly. Agna quickened her pace. She passed by dust-covered houses, narrow shops with shutters closed tight, and darted through alleys where she had once handed out pies to children. Now these alleys seemed deserted, devoid of the usual shouts and laughter. After walking a couple of more blocks, she finally reached the temple where Lucia's chambers were located. But Lucia was not there. "Where's the High Priestess?" Agna asked the attending servant. "She went to the Great Wall. She said she had to see something for herself," the servant replied, nervously fiddling with the edge of her mantle. Agna hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should call for help, but then realized that time was of the essence. If Lucia went alone, something terrible has happened. Her heart was pounding as she ran through the streets toward the city wall. Looking back, she noticed people standing in small groups, staring up. There, high above, crimson-red streaks twisted and swirled like living things. Under the dim sky, the city appeared ghostly. One step, another step, and she was already seeing the high walls surrounding the capital. The stone beneath them looked gray and dead under the crimson glow. Guards stood alert, many gripping spears and scanning the perimeter, watching the fields and distant roads. "Let me through. I'm from the Order of the Moonlit Night," Agna said shortly, showing her priestess sign. Two guards exchanged glances, nodded, and hurriedly opened the gate to the wall. She climbed the stone steps, trying not to think about what she might see. Something has happened. Her inner voice kept repeating. And then, reaching the top platform, Agna saw her. the High Priestess Lucia. The slender figure in a silver mantle with starry sky patterns stood at the very edge of the wall, leaning her hands on the cold stone. Her long silver hair blew in the wind. It seemed as though Lucia was staring into the distance, but her gaze was impenetrable. "My lady," Agna called softly, stepping closer. But Lucia didn't turn around. Her eyes were fixed downward beyond the wall. Agna placed her palm on the stone and looked where the priestess was gazing. Her heart sank. Below on the plain, something unimaginable was happening. Huge swarms of monsters, both large and small, of every shape and form, were running away from the wall as if fleeing from something. They were heading toward the center where a crimson vortex spun in the sky. Sometimes the clouds would be torn by a blinding flash of red light, and the monsters would screech, charging even faster, stretching into a giant column. They weren't trying to assault the city. They weren't growling or climbing the walls. It seemed as if all the foul creatures that had gathered on the borders over the years were now rushing toward one point, driven by a maddened call. Agna saw familiar nightmare silhouettes. Wolf-like creatures with blood-red cracks on their skin, beings with goatish faces that she had once read about in the Order's reports on demonic cults, grotesque monsters with rotting growths on their backs. All of them moved as a wave, sliding through the fields and tree lines that surrounded the capital. What's happening?" Agna breathed, turning to Lucia. The priestess remained silent for a few moments. It seemed as if she was listening to the sounds of the wind, to the cries of the dead souls, or to the call of the moon itself. When Lucia finally spoke, her voice sounded hollow and tense. "It has begun." Agna didn't immediately grasp the meaning of those words. She glanced at the bloody clouds, at the fleeing army of monsters, and felt a tremor in her hands. It has begun, like a sentence, like the final page of a scroll detailing how the world is fated to perish or be reborn. "But," Agna started, "why aren't they attacking? Why are they running away?" Lucia finally turned toward her. In the light of the crimson sky, her silver hair shimmered with the pale glow of the moon, and her eyes seemed bottomless. She took a deep breath. The city no longer matters to them. They are being called by the force that cracked the very sky. That whirlwind, it is the gathering point. The Red Plague has united them, herding them like cattle to the site of the final ritual. Agna clenched her fists. She imagined these swarms of monsters gathered in one place and felt anger flare within her. How much suffering had they already caused? But if this was just the prologue to something even more terrifying, "What should we do?" she asked, trying to suppress the fear gripping her. Lucia lowered her gaze, a shadow of doubt passing across her face. It seemed that even for the High Priestess of the Moonlit Night Order, this event posed a threat of immeasurable scale. "Agna," Lucia spoke softly, looking deep into her eyes, "the time has come. Our forces are gathering in the morning field to the north to march against the scourge. We cannot stand by." She stepped back from the parapet and gazed at the crimson sky. A gust of wind fluttered her mantle, but her voice now sounded firm, without a trace of doubt. "It's time to go to the final battle." With those words, Lucia turned and began descending the narrow stone steps leading down from the wall. Agna, feeling her heart tighten with the realization of what awaited them, quickly followed the priestess. At the foot of the wall, several adepts of the order were already standing, holding bags of healing tinctures and crystals, perhaps their last aid in the upcoming battle. The townspeople who had been watching the sky stepped aside anxiously as the priestesses passed by. It was as if the instinct for self-preservation had awakened in the city. People understood that something catastrophic was approaching. Agna glanced back at the wall from which she had just come. It seemed like only a moment ago she had been an ordinary novice priestess, dreaming of learning how to combine magic with swordplay to protect the orphans and the helpless. Now everything had escalated to an entirely different level. They would fight not against street gangs or a lone monster lurking on the outskirts of the city. They were about to face the very cause of this plague, a colossal force capable of tearing the world apart. She gritted her teeth and ran her fingers along the hilt of her sword, feeling the cold metal beneath her touch. The excitement and fear fought within her, battling against the resolve and fury toward these creatures. "I can do this! I must!" Raising her head, Agna saw Lucia turning the corner toward the main streets, further out of the city and toward the morning field. Agna hurried to follow. In the distance, she could hear screams and panic, but in the depths of her soul, a firm resolve burned. If this is the beginning of the end, I will be there until the last. I will not let the darkness win. Ahead, horses and several paladins awaited to accompany Lucia. The crimson clouds thickened relentlessly, and it seemed that with every passing moment, their red light grew brighter, almost unbearable to the eyes. The wind threw dust in their faces, and somewhere in the distance there were deep rumbles, as if the very earth was groaning from the impending battle. Lucia cast a brief glance at Agna, and in that gaze, Agna read everything. Apprehension, fear, and determination mixed together. Then the high priestess nodded, signaling to a lone horse that had been brought for Agna. "It's time to show what you've learned," Lucia said in a steady voice. "We're fighting not just for this city, but for the whole world." The girl stepped forward, took the reins with trembling hands, and silently vowed to herself that she would fulfill her duty. Beyond the walls, the streams of monsters were rushing away, merging into an ever thicker mass against the backdrop of the blood-red sky. Their roars could be heard even from here, low, prolonged, full of both rage and fear. But now, in Agna's heart, standing beside the priestess, only the voice of the moon's magic called her to battle, and Lucia's words, "It's time to go to the final battle." Richard stood at the edge of the rocky cliff, staring into the restless waves. The sea before him had grown even darker than before. The water resembled thick black silk, and the crimson glow reflected in it gave the surface a ghostly, blood-like hue. On both sides, towering cliffs loomed like timeless sentinels of this place. The wind howled through the stone cracks as if warning of an impending disaster. Behind Richard stood Finn. He nervously gripped his dagger in his hands. A little further away stood Lance, and beside him, Balthazar. One held a spear infused with dark magic, while the other habitually gripped his elegant cane, through which lunar power pulsed. Both looked focused and grim. The fourth was Andor, a tall old man in a black cloak. His face seemed frozen in eternal anger, but deep in his eyes unease churned. He ran his palm along the sheer stone wall beside him, and the dull pattern of runic symbols flashed with a soft light for a moment. "The platform is ready," he said dryly, stepping back. Beneath their feet, as if from the very earth, a familiar stone slab began to rise, the same one they had used for travel before. Emerging from the pulsating magical lines, it grew and solidified until it was large enough to accommodate all of them and their two loyal beasts, Enzio and Fury. The donkey named King nervously paced to the side, but hearing the familiar sound of magic, he reluctantly approached the platform. "Let's go," Richard said curtly, jumping onto Enzio, who snorted, sensing the salty wind and the danger ahead. The platform moved above the waves, cutting through the air a few feet above the surface. They could already see monstrous creatures occasionally surfacing from the water, resembling giant fish with clawed limbs. But unlike the last battle, the monsters didn't even try to attack. They swam furiously toward the shore, as if being led by some invisible force. As they passed by the platform, the monsters let out low growls, but didn't divert their attention to the group. Their eyes burned with a strange red fire, and their movements were sharp and awkward. "Look," Finn whispered, leaning forward. "Even when one of them gets injured, it doesn't stop." Indeed, in the distance, another predator with torn fins attacked its kin, tearing off part of its tail. But the injured one continued swimming forward, as if it felt no pain, no tearing flesh or blood loss. The torn pieces of its body remained behind, but the creature moved with determination, heading in the same direction as the rest. Lance frowned, gripping the spear shaft. "They seem hypnotized." Richard simply nodded, trying to hide his concern. Whatever these creatures were after, something had clearly commanded them to move toward a specific point. After all, during their last crossing of the sea, their group had to fend off attacks almost every minute. But now the monsters only concerned them because there were so many more of them. A whole horde filling the waters. Andor stood silently in the center of the platform, staring off into the depths of the blood-red sky. Half an hour passed in tense silence. The platform glided over the black water, and around them, the mist thickened, laden with salty dampness. By evening, the sea was behind them. They reached the familiar shore and disembarked onto solid ground. The group advanced a few more miles, and soon fields and forests unfolded before them, where dozens, even hundreds of creatures slithered. The beings moved in waves. Sometimes huge, grotesque figures would group into packs, but then scatter, continuing toward some central point. As they made their way through the low forest, Richard and the others encountered monsters that were so entranced that they didn't even attempt to attack. But sometimes they came across giants, those who raged and seemed to lose control of themselves. "We're going right," Richard ordered, as something resembling fused lizards with two heads and long spiked tails crawled onto the path. These creatures were the size of a carriage, and their bulging eyes burned with fury. The group had to split for a few seconds to avoid the beast, but realizing the path was blocked, Lance charged ahead. Raising his spear, he released a blast of black magic that flared with coal-black sparks and struck the lizard. It writhed in agony, while the second head continued to snarl and twitch. Balthazar cast a beam of light from his cane, and the creature's spiked tail broke off with a loud snap. But even after that, the lizard limped toward the general flow, leaving a trail of black slime behind. "Damn monsters never die," Finn cursed, directing Vines to finally hold the carcass and tear it apart. By the end of the day, they noticed in the distance how blood-red clouds began to spiral in the sky. They stretched in thunderous layers, and at the center a vortex began to form, resembling a giant funnel. The clouds seemed dense, almost tangible, stretching far down to the horizon. "Look, the clouds are spiraling like a hurricane," Lance said, squinting. But Richard knew that this was no ordinary hurricane. The very aura of the vortex reminded him of something ancient and ferocious, and the words of the vampire clan elder and Andor confirmed his worst fears. "Sharak," he whispered. "The dark god who was once imprisoned in another world. Now he's trying to return, using the power of the Red Plague." They hurried onward, striving to keep pace with the horde of creatures. Several times, they encountered monsters too large and menacing to ignore, forcing the group to eliminate them on the spot to clear the path. With every passing hour, it became increasingly clear. The closer they got to the blood-red vortex, the more the number of beasts grew. It was as if the very earth was pushing all its malevolent spawn toward the ritual's epicenter. The next day, the weary band emerged onto a vast plain that stretched unbroken to the horizon, devoid of forests or hills. Only barren earth, riddled with cracks and sparse vegetation, met their gaze. Yet at the heart of this desolation rose an enormous wall. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for the fortifications of a city or an ancient fortress, but as the group drew nearer, the truth became apparent. This was no ordinary structure. It was a chaotic assembly of stones, forming a maze of passages and corridors. "What in the world? A labyrinth?" Richard muttered, squinting at the edifice. The wall extended upward and outward for what seemed like hundreds of yards. Its gray-black blocks resembled ancient ruins that had been repositioned to create tangled pathways. Some corridors ran parallel to the wall, while others twisted inward in dizzying spirals. At key intersections stood strange columns that seemed to dissolve into the darkness above, shrouded in sand and dust. But the most unsettling sight was the unbroken flow of monsters pouring into the labyrinth. They moved silently, single-mindedly entering narrow passages that converged toward the center of the massive structure. The creatures paid no heed to their surroundings, their focus entirely on the red hurricane towering over the heart of the maze. Richard spurred his horse Enzio along the western edge of the wall, searching for an entry point. Creatures squeezed through breaches and arched portals, some human-sized, others towering dozens of feet high, as though meant for giants. "We have to go in," Richard said, turning to the others. "If we wander aimlessly, we'll get lost. But the stream of monsters seems to know the way." "Follow them?" Finn asked, frowning. "They could lead us straight into their lair." Andor squinted at the crimson vortex touching the earth in the distance. "That's exactly where we need to go. Our mission is to stop the return of Sharak." The group exchanged brief glances, all coming to the same grim conclusion. "We'll follow the stream," Richard announced. "If the labyrinth is a trap, the monsters will show us the way through it." They approached a nearby opening wide enough to admit them all. Inside, the air was cooler and carried a faint scent of dampness and ancient magic. Towering stone walls, slick with black moss, loomed 20 feet high, disappearing into the dimness above. The group felt the oppressive weight of the labyrinth's alien age and purpose. Deeper inside, they entered a narrow corridor which twisted sharply to the right, then left, forming a convoluted path. No markers guided the way, only occasional protrusions in the stone or inscriptions worn down by time. Cracks and fissures occasionally released a red mist that glowed faintly, lit by the ominous sky above. The monsters ahead left behind a trail of gore and slime. Some dragged mangled limbs, groaning or wheezing, yet they pressed forward. The group kept a cautious distance, ensuring they weren't noticed. The corridor opened into a junction, a circular chamber where multiple passages converged. A thin layer of water coated the floor, dripping from the stone blocks above. Stalactites dangled like claws, and the oppressive space made them feel insignificant. "This way," Richard said, spotting the main flow of monsters veering left. As they proceeded, more disturbing details emerged. The stone slabs bore runes in a language none of them recognized. Statues of grotesque figures, their distorted faces and unnaturally long arms pressed to their chests, stood silently, as though ready to spring to life. Crimson spores seeped from cracks in the walls, forming a glowing fog that clung to the ground. The architecture felt entirely foreign, nothing like the castles or dungeons of men. It radiated an otherworldly aura of magic and ancient power. "It's as if evil itself carved these halls from stone," Finn murmured. Andor ran a hand along the wall, his expression darkening. "This place predates the kingdoms of Ardentia, perhaps even the ancient wars. After navigating sharp turns and a few dead ends where they were forced to backtrack, they found themselves among a larger mass of monsters. Creatures poured in from side passages, merging into a single throng. It was clear they were on the right path. Richard tightened his grip on his sword as they advanced, noticing the air growing denser with a heavy, oppressive energy. A strange fog seemed to envelop them, making it harder to breathe. In the distance, a deep, rhythmic pounding echoed. Thump, 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 like the beat of a massive heart. Everyone in the group felt their own heartbeat falling into sync with the sound, an unnerving sensation that chilled them more than the monsters. "Do you feel that?" Balthazar asked, his pace slowing. "Yes," Lance replied, his voice tense. "It's like something is forcing my heart to match its rhythm." "It's Sharak's call," Andor said, his eyes narrowing. "He's creating a pulse to draw all corrupted beings to him. Even we can't completely resist it." Richard knew their time was running out. Fighting the rising fatigue in his body, he glanced at his companions, silently willing them to stay strong. "We have to reach the center and destroy the source of this evil before it's too late." Soon, they entered a hall that was the most spacious they had encountered within the labyrinth. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into the darkness above, while the walls, cracked and veined with pulsating crimson streaks, seemed to throb faintly under the flickering light of red clouds filtering through gaps high above. In the corners of the hall lay fragments of stone, statues or columns that had once adorned the space, now broken and coated in a grotesque, slimy residue. The group had barely taken a few cautious steps when the air filled with a strange, damp, rustling sound. At the center of the chamber, among the piled rubble and carcasses of smaller creatures, something moved. A spherical, blood-red mass of flesh, pulsating and emitting low, bubbling noises. At first glance, it looked like an enormous orb, woven from muscle and tissue, twitching as it exuded a grotesque aura. But as they stepped closer, an unspeakable human-like face began to emerge on its surface. A visage with distorted features, a gaping mouth, and wide, maddened eyes. "What in the hell is that?" Finn whispered, a chill running down his spine. Suddenly, the entity rose above the rubble, hovering unnaturally in the air. Its fleshy surface made a sickening, wet sound as it moved. The monstrous eyes widened, glinting with a tortured fury, and from its mouth erupted a gut-wrenching wail, shifting between sobbing and an ear-splitting shriek. The sound reverberated through the chamber, chilling them to their cores. The spherical demon lunged forward, hurtling toward the group like a massive living battering ram. It moved faster than anyone expected, slamming into Balthazar and knocking him off his feet. He tumbled backward several feet, landing heavily on his back, while the orb barreled onward, leaving behind a trail of viscous slime. Balthazar raised his staff and unleashed a beam of moonlight magic, which seared the side of the creature but failed to stop its advance. Finn summoned vines from the ground to ensnare the beast, but the orb's slick, slimy flesh caused the tendrils to slip off. Lance leapt to the side, thrusting his spear, wreathed in a dark aura, into the monster's side, leaving a deep, jagged wound. Yet the creature seemed immune to pain, responding only with even more guttural cries, which alternated between a child's sobbing and the moans of countless tortured souls. The sphere halted abruptly in midair, and as if turning to face its attackers, opened its massive mouth. From deep within, a piercing screech erupted, a deafening, mind-shattering sound that made the very walls tremble. The air itself seemed to vibrate, and the force of the sound made their ears ring. Richard, Finn, and Lance clutched their heads, trying in vain to block out the noise. Balthazar was thrown back by the shockwave, landing hard against a shattered column. Lance gritted his teeth, his legs buckling as a wave of weakness washed over him. The orb's scream seemed to claw at their very souls, paralyzing their muscles and drowning their resolve. The sound pressed against them like a tangible force, preventing any attempt to get closer. Richard felt his body trembling uncontrollably, his heart pounding as though trying to match the rhythm of the oppressive sound. Summoning every ounce of strength, Richard raised his sword, taking slow, determined steps forward. The sound felt like a wall of pure force, pushing him back with each step. His legs wobbled and his chest heaved with effort, but he pressed on. The demonic orb hovered just a few meters ahead, its monstrous wail growing louder as though it sought to shatter his very mind. But Richard didn't stop. With each step, he channeled the power of the druids into his blade, a blue glow spreading along the weapon's edge. As he reached the creature, he mustered all his strength and drove the sword straight into its gaping mouth. "Shut up!" he shouted, pouring his fury and magic into the strike. The blade sank deep into the fleshy orb, and the demon let out a guttural gasp, convulsing violently. Richard unleashed a surge of magical energy through the sword, the blade igniting with flashes of green and white light. The orb began to rupture, its wounds splitting open one by one. Finally, the monstrous sphere exploded, scattering a rain of blood and viscera across the chamber. Lance staggered back, shielding his face, while Finn wiped away the splattered gore with a shaky hand. Andor stood frozen, momentarily stunned by the gruesome spectacle. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the drip of viscous liquid from the ceiling and their ragged breaths. "Damn," Finn muttered, staring at the mangled remains of the creature strewn across the hall. "How are we supposed to get out of here if things like that are waiting for us?" "We will," Richard said, his voice resolute despite his exhaustion. Sheathing his sword, he glanced at his companions. They looked as worn as he felt. "We have to keep moving." Their footsteps echoed through the hall as they pressed onward. A long corridor bathed in an eerie red glow stretched before them, the distant roar of the vortex growing louder with each step. The labyrinth's end seemed tantalizingly close. At a crossing of corridors, the group paused to catch their breath and tend to their wounds. The air was thick with the bitter, metallic tang of blood and strange fumes that made their heads spin. After navigating a series of sharp turns, they entered a new chamber, this one resembling a square courtyard. Massive stone blocks formed the perimeter walls, but in the center loomed a colossal cubic structure of flesh. At first, it appeared lifeless, an inert, grotesque mass. But as Richard peered closer, he noticed eyes emerging from its sides. Enormous, lidless, bloodshot eyes that rolled in their sockets, scanning the room with an unsettling, predatory awareness. The cube shuddered, as if waking from slumber, and emitted a low, vibrating sound that made the walls tremble. The eyes on its side suddenly flared, firing beams of crimson energy, blindingly bright, like concentrated red lightning. One of the beams scorched the stone mere inches behind Lance, while another narrowly missed Finn, who barely managed to dive out of the way. "Spread out," Richard said, seeing the cube turn one of its sides toward them. To confuse the demon, they split up. Balthazar and Lance darted toward the right wall, Finn and Andor to the left, while Richard ran straight toward the center, drawing its attention. The creature's eyes darted independently, trying to track them all, and its beams carved deep, molten grooves into the stone floor, each shot accompanied by a menacing, resonant hum. "We need to destroy the eyes," Richard yelled, ducking behind a broken column. Balthazar, crouched behind a stone outcrop, focused the power of the moon. He suddenly sprang out, unleashing a brilliant burst of light from his staff. The beam struck one of the eyes dead center, causing it to burst, spewing a vile, viscous fluid. The cube quivered and let out a guttural roar of pain, but the other three eyes continued their relentless assault. Seizing the moment, Lance lunged forward, his spear crackling with black and violet energy. The tip of the spear struck the edge of another eye, tearing it open. Thick crimson slime poured down the cube's side as the second eye went dark. Meanwhile, Finn and Andor worked on the remaining sides. Finn slammed his hands against the stone floor, summoning thick vines that surged upward to entangle the cube. But the demon jerked violently, breaking free of the binds, then turned its third eye toward Finn. A beam of red light streaked toward him, narrowly missing and searing a hole into the wall behind him. Andor, clenching his fists, summoned pillars of stone from the ground. They erupted beneath the cube, striking its underside with tremendous force. A harsh, cracking sound echoed through the chamber, and the demon faltered but didn't collapse. However, the attack distracted it long enough for Finn to act. He leapt up, hurling a dagger with precision. The blade struck the third eye dead center. The cube trembled, emitting a monstrous wail as the eye exploded, spilling another wave of grotesque fluid. The cube swiveled, its final eye glowing with intense malice, and fired a beam directly at Richard. He threw himself to the side, simultaneously channeling druidic magic into his sword. The blade shimmered with emerald light, the energy dancing like flickering leaves. Richard swung the sword, releasing a wave of blue energy that struck the cube's surface, causing it to stagger. At that moment, Lance and Balthazar moved in unison. Lance's spear sliced through the edge of the remaining eye, while Balthazar's lunar magic pierced it from within. The monstrous cube convulsed as if in agony. Steam and fluid erupted from its sides, and its walls bulged and bubbled unnaturally. Finally, the entire structure collapsed, dissolving into a shapeless mass of flesh and ooze, with slimy membranes dangling like grotesque remains. The stench was overpowering, and Finn turned away, gagging as he clamped a hand over his nose. Everyone was exhausted from the fight. Their muscles ached, and their magical reserves were nearly depleted. Even Andor, who usually seemed invincible, was breathing heavily, leaning on his rune-carved staff. "We have to keep moving before more of those things crawl back here," Richard said quietly, trying to sound resolute. Fortunately, the corridors ahead were shorter. Soon they felt a gust of wind carrying the scent of open air. Winding through the labyrinth's final turns, the group finally saw a break ahead, a tall archway through which the crimson clouds outside shone more vividly. Despite their injuries and exhaustion, they quickened their pace. The monsters seemed to have vanished from the corridors, as if they had all surged forward toward their ultimate destination. They emerged onto a stone platform, resembling the remnants of an ancient gate. Glancing around, They realized the labyrinth they had fought through was merely part of a massive wall or fortification. Beyond it lay open ground, a plain stretching into the distance, filled with an unending flow of creatures. What greeted their eyes was a nightmarish battlefield, though no battle raged yet. Hundreds, thousands of monsters, from small, frail creatures to towering, hulking abominations, were converging on a single point. At the epicenter, a blood-red vortex spiraled upward. Crimson clouds descended to the ground in a churning funnel, and at its base, an eerie scarlet light pulsed, as though the sky itself had torn open, threatening to unleash something unimaginable. But the most horrifying sight was a colossal mountain of flesh at the vortex's base. It was as if the monsters, upon reaching the center, had begun to merge into a singular mass. Limbs fused together, and new grotesque growths sprouted from the writhing pile. Smaller creatures climbed over each other, their bodies melding, while blood and slime dripped down the mound. The whole mass heaved and pulsed, stretching upward as though trying to reach the swirling vortex above. "What kind of hell-spawned madness?" Finn whispered, his face pale as a sheet. The sight was almost unbearable, a grotesque tableau of chaos and corruption. But Richard forced himself to keep watching, steeling his resolve. He knew they had to act, and soon. Suddenly, the sky behind them glowed with a faint, shimmering light, accompanied by a strange, steadily growing hum. Richard spun around sharply. Emerging from the towers and walls of the labyrinth were levitating platforms, circular and made of stone, etched with glowing runes. With each passing second, they grew larger as they approached until the figures standing atop them became visible. The platforms descended gently near the group, landing softly on the stone ground. They were smooth, rounded stones adorned with intricate patterns resembling ancient magical inscriptions. Standing upon them were tall, regal figures with sharp, elegant features, clad in flowing garments of pastel hues, embroidered with symbols of an ancient script. At the feet of one figure rested orb-like devices, metallic spheres engraved with arcane patterns. Richard recognized the faces immediately. In past travels, they had encountered the Andals before, mystical people whose power and wisdom left an indelible impression. "The Andals," he murmured, turning to the others. Indeed, one of the figures on the central platform offered a reserved smile as his gaze met Andor's. He wore a light robe with a golden sheen, its collar adorned with swirling red and blue symbols. His long, silver-streaked hair was tied back neatly. "Tarsian Viral," Andor said, stepping forward, his voice tinged with surprise. The Andals descended from their platforms, and the man named Tarsian approached Andor slowly. They bowed deeply to each other, like old friends meeting after a long separation. "I am relieved to see you alive," Tarsian said quietly, his piercing gaze meeting Andor's. "We saw the omens in the sky and realized you did not succeed in completely destroying the witch, did you?" Andor nodded solemnly, his expression clouded with guilt. "We defeated part of the evil, but Sherrick has found another way to enter this realm. Time is running out." Tarsian sighed and lowered his head in agreement. "Then we must fight. We have come to aid you." He cast a scrutinizing look at Richard and the others, pausing on each of them as though assessing the strength of their auras. Balthazar gave a silent nod of acknowledgement, while Finn and Lance appeared slightly overwhelmed by the sudden arrival. Though relief flickered in their eyes, they needed allies now more than ever. Just then, a distant rumble reached them from the direction of the labyrinth. Richard turned to see groups of soldiers emerging from one of the wide stone openings. There were dozens in each formation, armed with spears, swords, and the occasional halberd. Interspersed among them were adepts in robes bearing sigils that Richard recognized, those of the Moonlit Knight and the Bright Flame Orders. The soldiers marched in orderly columns, assembling on the plain outside the labyrinth. Many bore signs of recent battle, bloodied armor and makeshift bandages betraying their struggles against the labyrinth's horrors. "Is that the kingdom's army?" Lance whispered. Richard nodded silently. At the rear of the ranks rode cavalry, and among them were mages with staffs, their robes emblazoned with crests and emblems. The army continued to pour forth, forming ranks as though preparing for a final assault. Soon a group of riders emerged from the vanguard and began approaching Richard and the Andals. The horses, dappled and gleaming in ornate tack, carried familiar faces. Among them was Lucia, High Priestess of the Moonlit Knight, clad in her dark robe embroidered with star patterns. Beside her rode Agna, her priestly garb draped over gleaming armor. And between them, atop a proud stallion, was King Larkus himself, his face weary yet resolute. "Richard!" Agna cried, dismounting first. Her eyes lit up with joy as she saw her friends alive. She hurried toward them, scanning Finn, Lance, and Balthazar, as if unable to believe her eyes. Her gaze lingered on Lance before she smiled at Finn and gave Balthazar an appreciative nod, clearly aware of his efforts in protecting Richard. Finally, she looked at Richard himself, her eyes filled with relief. "Thank the moon you're safe," she said softly. Lucia, the High Priestess, dismounted next, her attention immediately drawn to the Andals, her sharp gaze fixed on Tarsian and the glowing orbs by his feet, devices that had kept their platforms aloft. Her brow arched slightly. "Are these the Andals?" she asked. In response, Tarsian stepped forward, inclining his head gracefully as he offered a formal salute. "Yes, High Priestess, we are the Andals, and we have come to help this world in its mortal struggle against Sharak." His words carried a solemn weight, and Lucia composed herself before bowing in return. But before anyone could reply, a strange tremor rippled through the ground. Suddenly, figures began to rise from the earth itself, emerging as though passing through stone and soil. Richard tightened his grip on his sword, his pulse quickening. These were humans, clad in a variety of armor and robes. Among them were hardened warriors wielding greatswords, dark-robed mages with ominous staffs, and grim-faced archers. The ground continued to disgorge them in growing numbers, dozens, then hundreds. By the time it stopped, the force numbered no less than 1,000. "Demons," Finn whispered, readying himself for battle. Richard narrowed his eyes, realizing these weren't monsters at all. They're ordinary people warped by some dark magic. His gaze swept across the crowd until it froze on familiar faces. Master Erwin and Magister Arminth both stood at the forefront of the enemy force, their eyes blazing with fanatical zeal. "Traitors," Agna hissed through clenched teeth. Arminth stepped forward, surveying the king's army, the Moonlit Knight and Bright Flame Orders, the Andals, and Richard's group. His cold gaze landed on Richard, a twisted smile curling his lips. "You will go no further," he declared, his voice tinged with madness. "You will not stop Sharak's arrival." King Larkus, who had been composed until now, stepped forward, gripping his sword hilt tightly. His voice thundered across the plain. "You betrayed the kingdom, Magister. You don't decide who goes where. Stand down, or I'll execute you myself for treason." A tense silence fell over the plain. The two armies faced each other, each side poised for a fight. On one side, the king's soldiers, the adepts of the Moonlit Knight and Bright Flame Orders, the Andals led by Tarsian and Richard's companions. On the other, 1,000 corrupted warriors and mages bound by the traitor's dark will. Above, storm clouds churned ominously, and in the distance, the mountain of flesh grew ever larger, its grotesque mass reaching toward the blood-red vortex in the sky. Suddenly, a whistling sound filled the air, drawing everyone's attention upward. 12 figures descended from the sky, gliding toward the battlefield with the aid of some sorcery. Men and women in long, hooded robes floated above the stone platform, their faces obscured. Each radiated an unmistakably powerful, magical aura. "More arrivals?" Agna gasped, clutching her chest. The sheer convergence of forces in one place left her visibly shaken. One figure lowered ahead of the others. Through the thin veil of mist, Richard recognized the face, partially hidden beneath a hood. Greasy hair, a sardonic smirk, and a missing left arm. It was Jenner, a rogue mage with whom Richard had a complicated history. "Of all people," muttered Magister Arminth, his lip curling in disdain. "That whelp?" Jenner responded with a loud, mocking laugh, his voice echoing across the field. "Hello, old man," he called, his tone dripping with derision. "Still clinging to life, are you? I told you one day you'd pay for everything. Well, consider this my long-awaited rematch." The 11 mages behind Jenner remained silent, their stances tense and ready for anything. "Jenner," Richard whispered, shifting into a defensive stance, unsure of what to expect from the rogue mage. Jenner tilted his head, his smirk widening as his gaze settled on Richard. "Don't scowl at me, friend. This time, I'm on your side. I'd rather not see Sharuk devour the world." With that, Jenner turned his attention back to Arminth, his smirk fading into a cold, calculating glare. The message was clear. He intended to fight against the traitors, not the king's forces. Another uneasy silence settled over the field. Suspicion hung thick in the air. No one trusted Jenner completely. Was this genuine or just another of his infamous schemes? Regardless, one thing was certain. A battle was imminent. On one side stood Arminth and Erwin's corrupted army. On the other, King Larkus and his allies, including the Andals, Richard's group, and Jenner's enigmatic cohort of 12 mages. A flash of lightning tore through the stormy sky, briefly illuminating every face on the battlefield. Behind them, at the base of the crimson vortex, the mountain of flesh heaved violently, releasing a deafening, otherworldly roar. 1,000 tortured voices crying out in unison. Time itself seemed to hold its breath, teetering on the edge of chaos. "Is everyone ready?" Andor asked, gripping the runed staff tightly. In response, the armies shifted into battle positions. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on every heart. Each person clung to a singular hope: to stop Sharuk from breaking into their world. A thunderclap tore through the blood-red clouds above the battlefield as Jenner and his 11 companions, the Apostles, swept into action. Hovering in the air, they spread out in formation, their hands and staves emitting bursts of pulsating energy. Spells flared in shades of pale white, violet, and deep black, crashing into the ranks of Magister Arminth's and Master Erwin's forces. "Attack!" one of the Apostles shouted, unleashing a salvo of destructive magic that tore through the enemy's lines. Simultaneously, the Andals moved into position. Some formed a semicircle, drawing their peculiar bows, whose strings glowed with an unstable, dark radiance. Their arrows shimmered with alternating black and brilliant white auras like lunar light. Upon striking their targets, the projectiles exploded with devastating force, sending sprays of scorched flesh and arcane energy into the air. The acrid stench of burning flesh and magic spread across the battlefield. "Cover the left flank!" called one of the Andals. Two archers immediately shifted positions, targeting Arminth's mages attempting to flank King Larcus's forces. Meanwhile, Tarsian Viral and his closest allies ascended once more on their levitating platforms. The metallic spheres at their feet began to glow, their intricate engravings shimmering as if liquid light coursed through them. Moments later, blinding beams shot out, not at the enemy soldiers, but directly into the grotesque mass of flesh rising toward the crimson vortex. From above, these radiant blasts tore through the monstrous column, shearing off massive sections of slimy, writhing tissue. Chunks of flesh rained down, accompanied by anguished roars from the malformed creatures. "They're attacking the vortex itself." Richard realized as he watched each shot disintegrate part of the grotesque structure. "What kind of magic is that?" he whispered in awe, having never seen such a seamless blend of technology and sorcery. But there was no time to ponder. The battle between King Larcus's forces and the traitorous legion burned fiercely, like a wildfire in a gale. Spells erupted from both sides, lighting the battlefield in chaotic bursts of color. Lucia and Agna fought shoulder to shoulder with the paladins of the bright flame, their radiant magic cutting through dark sorcery. Balthazar, Finn, and Lance pushed deep into enemy lines, wielding a blend of moonlight spells, elemental forces, and raw combat prowess. Overhead, Jenner and his apostles unleashed swirling torrents of black fire, raining devastation onto the enemy. Fury and Enzio tore through the melee, trampling foes and spreading chaos among the ranks. Richard surveyed the battlefield. Across the plain, Sharak's abominations, grotesque and misshapen, surged forward. But many fell under the relentless beams of the Andals and the Apostles' magic. The air was thick with the sense of sulfur, blood, and arcane energy, and the cacophony of battle roared in his ears. Richard made a decision. The source of the evil had to be destroyed. The Vortex's flesh tower, now writhing and nearly complete, was beginning to take shape, its pulsating mass ready to unleash Sharak's essence into the world. "Hold the line here," he said to his companions as they dispatched the last of Erwin's knights. "I'm going for the vortex." "Be careful," Finn's voice called after him, but Richard was already charging forward, his sword shimmering with green and silver light. A few dark warriors moved to block his path, leveling their spears. With a wave of his hand, Richard called upon druidic energy, releasing a beam of light that knocked them aside. Without slowing, he leapt over the fallen enemies, dodging a blade thrust from another. "Out of my way," he growled, cleaving through a soldier who lunged at him with a dagger. The force of his strike sent the man flying into two of his comrades. Breaking free from the chaotic melee, Richard sprinted across the scarred plain, its surface cracked and stained with dark, viscous fluids. Above, the Andal beams continued to rain down, while Jenner's spells and the cries of beasts echoed in the distance. All around him, humans and monsters fell, their blood soaking the ground. Yet Richard felt only a single driving purpose: to destroy the abomination before it could complete its unholy transformation. As he neared the monstrous tower of flesh, it loomed higher than he had anticipated. A pulsating amalgamation of twisted limbs, malformed faces, and sinewy tendrils. The grotesque mass was entwined with the crimson vortex, its branches of flesh stretching upward like hands clawing at the storm above. Nearby, wounded creatures, some limping, others dragging their mangled bodies, continued to crawl toward the mass, driven by an invisible force. They seemed oblivious to their injuries, their grotesque forms converging into the tower as if hypnotized by Sharak's call. Overhead, the Andal's beam seared through sections of the column, sending chunks of viscera tumbling down, but the flow of bodies was relentless. The closer Richard got, the louder he heard the demonic heartbeat, a rhythmic, suffocating pulse that seemed to vibrate through his chest. It was an oppressive, primal sound, as if the earth itself was echoing the essence of Sharak's impending arrival. Richard tightened his grip on his sword, feeling its druidic energy surge in response to his determination. He stepped closer to the tower, steeling himself for the fight of his life. This was the heart of the nightmare, and it had to be stopped. Richard wiped the sweat dripping into his eyes and quickened his pace. He could see the vortex pulsing, dragging the grotesque flesh column higher and higher, as though assembling a colossal body. Overhead, a deep hum resonated. The Andal platform unleashed another radiant beam, shearing off a massive chunk of the writhing mass and sending it crashing to the ground. The abominations let out an unearthly howl. "Just a little more," Richard whispered, raising his sword as he searched for the point where the energy converged, the heart of the monstrosity. But suddenly, the vortex fell silent, as if a switch had been flipped. The red-streaked clouds froze in place, and the grotesque column of flesh stopped climbing. Instead, the entire structure began to compress, bubbling and shifting. The heartbeat, once so deafening, ceased entirely. Silence enveloped the battlefield. Then came a low, ominous hum, followed by a jarring, resounding thump, like a giant's heartbeat restarting. The sound reverberated across the battlefield, pounding in the chest of every living being. Before Richard's eyes, the column of flesh transformed, reshaping itself into a monstrous form forged from hundreds of fused bodies. The creature towered dozens of feet high, a demonic titan of crimson flesh. Its grotesque limbs ended in tentacle-like appendages, bristling with bone-like blades. Across its malformed body, dozens of blood-red eyes with triangular pupils blinked erratically, radiating primal malice. It exuded an aura of pure terror, tangible and suffocating. On the far side of the field, the traitors, Arminth, Irwin, and their followers, fell to their knees, enraptured by the sight of their unholy deity. The rest of the battlefield fell silent. Archers, mages, soldiers, even the Andals aboard their levitating platforms, all froze, their gazes locked on the towering monstrosity, as it seemed to drain the light from the very air. The red eyes scanned the battlefield, darting from one fighter to another, as though peering into their very souls. Its gaze carried a dreadful aura, chilling the hearts of even the bravest. Some soldiers screamed and staggered back, clutching their chests as an unnatural cold gripped them. Richard felt the creature's oppressive presence, an overwhelming sense that it saw everything, his thoughts, his past, his future, and sought to dissolve him into eternal darkness. He clenched his jaw, fighting against the rising tide of despair. But when the demon's many eyes focused directly on him, it unleashed a deafening roar. The sound was a cacophony of scraping, howling, and wailing voices, merging into a single horrific note. Richard nearly stumbled. "Don't give in!" he commanded himself, forcing his mind to focus. He began to gather his magic, feeling the natural energy within him respond, stronger than ever before. "Grah!" he grunted, closing his eyes as his body felt heavier than lead. His heart pounded furiously, threatening to burst. Around him, green streaks and silver sparks flickered into existence. The air thickened, and his hair rose as though caught in a wind generated by his own power. Through the haze of noise and chaos, he heard disjointed cries and knew there was no turning back. To gather this much power meant risking everything, but it was the only choice. He recalled every lesson, every battle, every trial, and then something inside him clicked. The barrier holding back his full potential shattered, and a tidal wave of magic surged through him. When he opened his eyes, even the demon froze momentarily, sensing the shift in energy. Richard's sword blazed with a brilliant blue light, streaked with silver and gold sparks. "I won't let you destroy this world," he growled through gritted teeth. The demon roared again, a maddening symphony of voices, and extended a tentacle, bristling with jagged bone spines toward him. But Richard dashed forward, his boot striking the cracked earth with purpose. Time seemed to slow as he pushed himself further, feeling his newfound strength coursing through his body. With a final superhuman leap, he launched himself into the air, higher than he had ever jumped before. With a mighty swing, Richard unleashed his magic. From his sword erupted an enormous blue beam, a column of celestial fire so bright it eclipsed the crimson light of the vortex. The beam seared through the demon's chest, piercing the fused mass of bodies, eyes, and limbs. The monster screamed in agony, a deafening multi-voiced wail that made the earth tremble. The air itself vibrated with the force of its anguish. The demon's cry turned into a guttural roar as its body shuddered violently, then a blinding flash erupted from its core. The explosion was so immense that it shook the ground like an earthquake. A shock wave of energy rippled across the plain, sending both enemies and allies flying. Those who weren't behind cover were thrown dozens of feet. The Andal platforms wobbled precariously, struggling to stay aloft. Richard felt an invisible fist slam into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. For a moment, it seemed as though he was tumbling into nothingness. Light filled his vision, a white brilliance that drowned out everything else. His head spun, his mind fogged, and the last thing he saw was the collapsing shadow of the demon, its form disintegrating into the void. Then the blinding light consumed him entirely. The deafening roar of the elemental explosion lingered in his ears, even as everything faded. The ground, the sky, the battle, all of it seemed to tremble under the aftermath of the collision. Richard lay on the cracked ground, listening to the distant cries of the wounded. His eyes stung from the blinding flash caused by his own attack, but gradually his vision cleared. Blinking, he tried to focus, and what he saw made his breath catch. The sky was brightening. The oppressive, blood-red darkness that had long cloaked the world was dissipating, melting away like smoke on the wind. Above him, the first rays of sunlight pierced through, casting their warm glow onto the battlefield. A strange, bittersweet feeling seized Richard's chest, a mix of relief and disbelief. He realized how deeply he had missed the sun. After endless battles and wandering in darkness, it had seemed as though daylight was lost to him forever. And yet, here it was, shining down as if nothing had changed. Victory? Could it be? The thought flickered in his mind. Too drained to move, he lay still, gazing up at the azure sky like it was the first miracle he had ever witnessed. Voices interrupted his reverie, along with the thudding of footsteps drawing closer. Through his ragged breaths, he heard a familiar, panicked cry. "Richard!" It was Agna. Summoning his last reserves of willpower, he pushed himself up onto his elbow. She ran to him, her face a mixture of fear and joy, and when she reached him, she threw her arms around him. For a brief moment, the pain melted away. "You're alive," she whispered, clutching him tightly. Richard managed to stand, albeit shakily, with her support. He looked around at the faces of his companions. Balthazar sat atop his faithful donkey. King, looking as stoic as ever, though his weariness was evident. Nearby, Finn grinned, a rare wide smile on a face usually clouded with grim determination. Even Lance, standing a little further back, smirked and gave a thumbs up as if to say, "Nice work." The massive bear, Fury, and the wolf, Enzio, loitered nearby, their restless energy softened by the momentary calm. Enzio seemed eager to approach Richard, perhaps to nuzzle or lick him, but hesitated, not wanting to interrupt. In the distance, Lucia, the high priestess, stood lost in thought. Her furrowed brow and tense posture worried Richard. Was it truly over? Pulling away from Agna, Richard turned toward the spot where the mountain of flesh and the crimson vortex had once loomed. Now there was nothing. Just a barren, scorched expanse. No debris, no remnants of the monstrous entity. It had vanished as if erased from existence. Did we win? He thought. But deep down, he felt an unsettling disquiet. Sharak was no ordinary foe. He was a primordial god, sealed in another dimension. Could something so ancient and powerful truly be destroyed in a single strike? His unease was confirmed moments later when a suffocating pressure descended upon the battlefield. It was as though an invisible weight, heavier than a mountain, pressed down on everyone. Soldiers froze mid-step, gripping their weapons tightly as their eyes darted around. The oppressive aura drained the strength from their limbs, leaving even the bravest feeling exposed and vulnerable. Richard's pulse quickened. His breath came shallow and fast as he scanned the field. Then he saw it, a figure descending from the now clearing sky, gliding gently like a feather on the breeze. Slowly, it came into focus. A young man clad in tight, blood-red garments that shimmered against the dissipating clouds. His short black hair, sharp, almost elven features, and piercing eyes gave him an ethereal, unsettling beauty. His delicate frame exuded both elegance and menace, blurring the line between masculine and feminine. As he touched down, the most terrifying thing about him was his aura. It was crushing, like a colossal, invisible boulder bearing down on everyone nearby. Soldiers and allies alike instinctively stepped back. Some even stumbled under the weight of his presence. The man began walking toward them with deliberate, fluid movements. Then, without warning, he accelerated, and in an instant, he was directly in front of Richard. What? Richard barely managed to exhale before the figure vanished and reappeared behind him, as though mocking their perceptions. His heart raced, and for a moment, no one dared to move, fearing the stranger's unimaginable power. Finally, the figure stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the group. His eyes were cold and calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Well, well," he said softly, his voice carrying unnaturally across the battlefield. "So, you're the moon's chosen warrior?" He addressed Richard directly. "But I don't sense your full power. You haven't used the key." "What a pity." Richard froze, his mind racing. "The key? What does he mean?" But before he could respond, the stranger continued, "And tell me, how do you plan to fight the Devourers without it, Who are you?" Richard finally managed to ask, his breath shaky. His hand instinctively slid to the hilt of his sword, ready to defend himself if necessary. The young man merely smirked, brushing his short hair from his forehead. "You already know me. I am Sharak." Richard's heart seemed to stop for a moment. Behind him, he heard gasps and muffled cries of fear. Everyone understood that this was no longer some monstrous proxy of flesh. This was the god himself, manifest in full power. If he wished, he could obliterate them all with a mere flick of his hand. Sharak arched an eyebrow, his amusement evident as he watched the fear ripple through the group. Suddenly, with incomprehensible speed, he darted toward King Balthazar's donkey. A sharp gust of wind swept through the soldiers as the god moved faster than their eyes could follow. The poor donkey let out a terrified scream and collapsed, unconscious under the sheer weight of Sharak's presence. Balthazar barely clung to the saddle, swearing loudly as he scrambled to steady himself. Sharak paused momentarily, seemingly bemused by the animal's reaction. "Strange creature," he muttered before his attention shifted. From a bag hanging off the donkey's saddle, he snatched an object. A blue skull etched with intricate glowing patterns. Richard recognized it immediately. It was the artifact Balthazar had received from an ancient dragon, a potent and enigmatic relic that the mage had kept close for emergencies. Sharak tossed the skull in his hand, almost playfully, as it began to glow faintly from within. The god's gaze swept across the group, his voice cutting through the air with mockery. "Well? Will you use it yourself? Or shall I make you?" His eyes narrowed as he addressed Richard directly, a taunting grin on his face. Richard glared at him, unsure why Sharak wanted him to wield the artifact. No one knew the full extent of the skull's power, or its potential consequences. Sharak's sharp smile widened as he seemed to revel in their uncertainty. His gaze flickered across the battlefield until it landed on the group of apostles, led by Jenner. The rogue mage and his companions had just begun to recover from the earlier battle. The moment Sharak's eyes met theirs, his expression shifted. A flicker of pure rage ignited in his gaze. Without warning, the god lunged toward them. No one could even track his movement. In an instant, two of the apostles collapsed, their bodies shriveling as though their very life force had been burned away. Their agonized screams echoed across the field before they were silenced forever. "No!" Jenner cried out, stumbling back in horror. He could see what was happening. Their lives were being extinguished instantly, without any chance of defense. Sharak raised his hand again, preparing to unleash death upon the remaining apostles, but Jenner, his voice trembling, shouted, "Retreat! Quickly! Open a portal!" The remaining 10 apostles hastily summoned a magical gateway, their hands trembling as they tore a rift in the air. They leapt through in chaotic panic, Jenner among them disappearing in a flash of light. The portal snapped shut just as Sharak glanced at it with disdain. He made no move to pursue, instead casting a cold, dismissive look at the closed rift. "Cowardly vermin," he muttered with a sneer. Turning his attention to the Andals, Sharak noted their submissive silence, their heads bowed respectfully. It was clear they understood the futility of opposing a god. Sharak regarded them briefly, his lips curling into a faint smirk, before letting out a quiet, derisive snort. After a moment of oppressive stillness, he returned his focus to Richard. In the blink of an eye, Sharak materialized beside him, almost silently. He continued to toss the glowing blue skull between his hands as though it were a trivial bauble. His dark hair, illuminated by the vibrant sunlight, was a stark contrast to his crimson attire. He seemed to embody the clash of light and shadow that hung over the battlefield, a being both radiant and terrifying. There they stood, the mortal survivors, frozen in place, and the divine entity, radiating power so intense it seemed to crush the air itself. Around them, the once chaotic battlefield had fallen eerily silent. The sunlight broke through the dissipating clouds, casting golden rays onto the scorched ground, while the distant horizon still smoldered with the remnants of battle. The shattered walls and corpses of monstrous abominations littered the plain, Sharak stared at them for a moment with a detached gaze, as if playing absent-mindedly with the blue skull in his hands. Then, seemingly deciding that the situation had reached a deadlock, he looked around. His gaze lingered on the faces of Richard's friends, and on the weary but determined eyes of Richard himself. The god seemed to grasp their bond, realizing where the weak spot lay. "Boring," Sharak muttered quietly, and suddenly lunged at Balthazar. His movement was like a lightning flash. No one even had time to raise their weapon before Sharak struck. Balthazar was thrown several feet away, landing with a dull thud and losing consciousness. "No!" Richard shouted, raising his sword, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. He couldn't match the god's inhuman speed. Sharak darted toward Lance and Finn. They tried to defend themselves, but he knocked them down with 1 or 2 blows. Painful cries echoed across the plain, and Richard froze in terror, unsure whether his friends were still alive. Despair tore at his heart. He was unable to intercept Sharak even for a fraction of a second. In that instant, the god vanished and reappeared behind Agna. She didn't even have time to turn around. Sharak clamped his thin fingers around her throat and lifting her sword several yards into the air. Agna struggled for air, gasping helplessly. Richard dashed forward, but what could he do? If he struck too hastily, Sharak could kill her in an instant. Sharak simply grinned from above, seeing the fury and helplessness in Richard's eyes. Then, with one hand, he tossed the blue skull to the ground, right at Richard's feet. "If you want to save her, use this key," he said in an almost casual tone, as if suggesting something trivial. Richard looked up at Agna, whose eyes were rolling back from suffocation, and a tormenting thought flashed through his mind. "If I do this, I'll lose my humanity. But if I don't, she'll die." All the warnings about the skull's magic permanently changing him surged through his memory. He glanced at the artifact lying on the stones. A familiar voice sounded in his head. The sword Elric, his loyal companion once imbued with sentience, spoke to him. "Sorry, buddy, but it looks like you'll have to do it. I don't see any other way to defeat a god who can destroy everything instantly." The realization that there was no choice hit Richard like a cold downpour. His heart clenched, but he still bent down and slowly picked up the skull. Well, the thought flickered in his mind. As soon as it formed, the skull's eye sockets flared with a bluish light. Richard felt as if the space around him shuddered, and in the next instant he was pulled inward, a void of lights, vibrations, and energy. The world went dark, and his consciousness hurtled down a corridor of shimmering lines as if he himself had become a streak of light. He saw countless worlds flying over endless cities, fiery deserts, and massive metallic structures that seemed to belong to another era. He felt the pain of others' deaths, the tears of a mother who had lost her child. He saw a soldier sitting in a trench amid war, and the cosmos, dotted with weightless stars and strange iron machines traversing the darkness. All these universes merged into one immense stream. Richard's soul ignited with a sense that he was touching the truth, something he had only faintly guessed at before. Suddenly, the corridor dissolved, and Richard realized he was in a new body. He felt the cool breeze and soft foliage beneath his paws. He looked down and saw that his front limbs were wolf's paws covered in blue-black fur. Beside him stood a she-wolf with similar bluish fur. Her eyes glowed with a wise, sorrowful light. Richard realized their connection was telepathic. They stood on the giant branch of a tree whose trunk disappeared into the heavens. Yggdrasil, he realized, recalling ancient legends. The she-wolf spoke mentally, urging him to follow her. and they moved across the twisted branches with such ease it felt as if they had lived their whole lives on the tree. Vines, lush leaves, and sparkling moss were bathed in a gentle blue glow. After some time, they reached a hollow from which the light of blue stones glimmered on the walls. In the center was a small nest woven from branches. Richard, still in his wolf form, approached and saw a child, human but with wolf-like features, blue hair, and eyes like shimmering crystals. The baby smiled at Richard, and in his presence Richard felt a strange thrill, a sense of kinship and a great purpose. But before he could make sense of it, explosions thundered outside. Peeking out, Richard saw flying platforms and human figures in black uniforms. Devourers! The thought shot through his mind. The she-wolf urged him to hurry, warning that the enemy was closing in. A portal opened in the hollow's wall, glowing with the same blue light. She nodded toward the passage. Richard didn't want to leave her behind, but she insisted. "Protect the child. I'll hold them off." Her voice echoed in his mind. Feeling the sharp pain of parting, Richard ran to the infant and gently touched its tiny hand. The boy laughed, and in that moment, Richard felt something click inside him. His power suddenly surged to a new level, as if he had unlocked some hidden depth. The she-wolf shouted telepathically, urging him to hurry. Clutching the child to his chest, Richard leaped into the portal, his heart breaking for the she-wolf he left behind. The world around him shimmered with blue flashes, dissolving Yggdrasil's branches into light. Richard jerked as if surfacing from water. His body ached, but he realized he was once again back in the field where he had just seen Shareak holding Agna by the throat. Where were the she-wolf, the infant, and Yggdrasil? Everything that had happened felt like a dream, yet he felt a new power within him, raw, wild, and unyielding. He rose, stunned to discover that he had grown. His muscles were larger, and his skin was covered in thick, bluish-gray fur. His hands had turned into paws with long claws. His heart pounded furiously, filling his body with overwhelming strength. A werewolf. The thought flickered through his mind. Was this his new permanent form? "Agna!" he called out instinctively, spinning toward where he had last seen her. Shareak still held her high above the ground, his grip unrelenting around her slender neck. Agna barely struggled anymore. Her strength was gone, and fear was etched into her face. But Richard, no longer hesitating, lunged forward, feeling explosive power surge through his legs. Dust flew as he closed the distance in a single moment, tearing Agna from the god's grasp. "What?" Shareak exhaled, momentarily stunned. He clearly hadn't expected such speed. Richard landed, gently lowering Agna to the ground beside a stunned Lucia, who immediately knelt to check Agna's pulse. The girl was alive, but unconscious, her breathing shallow. Richard ran a clawed hand through her hair, needing to confirm she would be okay. Then he lifted his head, fury boiling in his chest. Shareak scowled, and the next moment blurred into chaos. The god surged forward like lightning, unleashing devastating strikes. But Richard, feeling his newfound strength and reflexes, dodged, deflecting the blows with his fur-covered arms and countering with a powerful lunge. Their collision sounded like thunder. A shockwave rippled outward, scattering debris and dust. Was the mentor on the tree this strong? No. But why am I? Thoughts raced through Richard's mind as claws clashed with Shareak's hands. The god's strength was unimaginable. His strikes could shatter stone. Richard parried them, his limbs burning with strain, his heart pounding like a war drum. Yet he knew the power within him was nearing a godlike level. The question was whether it would be enough to break Shareak. "Ha!" Shareak suddenly sneered, slamming a hand onto Richard's back and driving him into the ground. Richard growled in pain but tensed and broke free, attacking from the side. His claws raked across Sharek's crimson robes, leaving deep gashes. The god recoiled, rage flashing across his face. "You dare, beast!" Sharek growled, seizing Richard's arm and gripping it like a vice. Richard hissed in pain. "No matter. I'll put you in your place." Richard was ready to tear the god apart, but he didn't get the chance. Suddenly the world dimmed, and his consciousness felt a violent pull, as though a cosmic vortex had swallowed them both. Space itself fractured, and Richard felt himself being dragged into something. He struggled, but Sharek's grip was like iron shackles. A moment later, darkness consumed them, and silence roared in Richard's ears. When his vision began to return, he looked around. They were floating in a vast darkness surrounded by swirling cosmic clouds of shadow. Hovering stone fragments and debris dotted the expanse, chunks of what seemed to be a ruined world. There was no solid ground beneath Richard's feet, only drifting slabs, as if remnants of a shattered reality. "Where am I?" Richard asked himself mentally, his eyes fixed on Sharek, who stood across from him on a small floating rock. The god smirked, looking pleased. Richard bared his teeth, growling low. He could sense that most of his strength remained intact, but a cold fear stirred in his chest. In this alien dimension, human laws of nature might not apply. Time in this black realm seemed to stand still, and Richard, feeling the weight of his own resolve, understood. The battle had only just begun,